I woke up that morning thinking it would be like any other day in my quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was just peeking through the curtains, birds chirped lazily, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen. I went and checked my mailbox out of habit, expecting to find the usual stack of letters, junk mail, maybe a small package or two. Instead, it was empty, completely empty, not a single envelope, not even the flyers that normally pile up and annoy me. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe the mail carrier had been late, or maybe my neighbor accidentally grabbed something for me. It didn't feel like a big deal. But then as the day went on, I noticed things. Little things that didn't add up. A bill I knew I had sent a check for, missing. A personal letter from my sister that was supposed to arrive last week, gone. A package containing a birthday gift for my niece that I had ordered weeks ago, vanished. And it wasn't like I had a complicated life. My mail was straightforward, predictable, and generally boring. Yet somehow things kept disappearing. I started to pay closer attention. I watched from my porch as the mail carrier did his usual route. He didn't seem unusual, no signs of packages being dropped in the wrong place. Nothing. It was like my mail simply vanished into thin air. And then as I walked down the street to grab a package from my neighbor's porch that had been mistakenly delivered there, I noticed something strange. HOA Karen was outside her house. She was the type of neighbor everyone knows, the one who micromanages the entire street, wears her HOA authority like a badge of honor, and makes sure everyone follows the rules, whether they know it or not. She smiled at me that way she does, all sweet teeth and too much perfume, and held something in her hands. Something that looked suspiciously like one of my envelopes. My stomach dropped. Could it really be? I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was hers, maybe she was holding someone else's mail, but deep down I knew better. I'd seen the way she lingered near the mailboxes, the way she seemed to know who was receiving what, and how she always had an opinion about every little thing in the neighborhood. A sinking feeling spread through me. I realized that this was not an accident. My mail was being stolen, and the person responsible was standing right in front of me. I considered confronting her immediately. I imagined the scene, me politely asking for my mail back and her gasping in outrage, claiming innocence, maybe accusing me of paranoia. The thought made me tense. I didn't want a public scene, not in front of other neighbors and certainly not with her. HOA Karen thrived on attention, especially the kind that put her in control. No, I needed to think this through. I needed a plan. Over the next few days, I tried subtle tactics. I would check my mailbox at different times, sometimes just peeking from the window, sometimes walking casually down the street. I made mental notes of when she was around, how she moved, how quickly she seemed to appear whenever something arrived. It was unnerving. It felt like living in a neighborhood where you weren't entirely safe, like being watched by someone who thought they had the right to interfere with your life. Every time I saw her, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone be so bold? Then came the moment I could no longer ignore. I caught her glancing around nervously before reaching into my mailbox and taking out a letter. She stuffed it into her bag and walked back inside like nothing had happened. My heart raced. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. My mail was being stolen and there was no denying it. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just wait and hope it would stop. I had to take action. I had to find a way to catch her in the act, with proof so undeniable that even she couldn't wriggle out of it. And that's when the idea hit me. If this was serious, if HOA Karen was this bold, I couldn't handle it alone. I needed someone with authority, someone who understood the seriousness of mail theft. That's when I thought of the postal inspector. I knew involving a federal officer would be dramatic, maybe even intimidating, but I also knew it might be the only way to finally stop her. Little did I know, involving the inspector would turn my quiet street into a scene of suspense, drama, and a little bit of humor. And it all started with that one missing envelope. I knew I couldn't just let HOA Karen keep taking my mail, so I decided it was time to confront her. I tried to tell myself to stay calm, to be polite, to approach it like a normal neighborly conversation. But the truth is, I was nervous. Confronting her felt like stepping into a lion's den, and Karen had always been good at making herself the center of attention. I walked up her driveway, my heart pounding, trying to appear casual. She was sitting on her porch, sipping what looked like iced tea, wearing her signature sunglasses and a perfectly pressed blouse. She looked up and smiled at me. That smile was the kind that made you question your own instincts. It was too bright, too calculated. I swallowed and said, "Hey Karen, I think some of my mail might have got mixed up, maybe you've seen it." Her eyes widened dramatically. She gasped, putting a hand to her chest like I'd accused her of something unthinkable. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed. "I can't believe you would even think such a thing. I would never take anyone's mail. How dare you?" She sounded genuinely offended, but her eyes flicked down to the bag sitting next to her chair, and I could have sworn I saw something white peeking out. I tried to stay calm, my voice steady. "Look, I'm not accusing anyone. I just want to figure out where my letters and packages are going. I've noticed a few missing items recently, and I'm trying to get them sorted." She leaned back in her chair, scoffing lightly. "Oh, you're just being paranoid. Maybe the mail carrier is messing up. Maybe you're imagining things." She smiled, sweet but sharp like a knife disguised as frosting. "I just helped the community, that's all." I couldn't help but notice how rehearsed she sounded. Everything she said had this air of performance, like she had practiced every word in front of a mirror. Her confidence was unnerving. I realized that if she really was taking my mail, she wasn't afraid of confrontation. She thrived on it. Trying not to let my frustration show, I asked a few more questions, but she waved them off with exaggerated gestures. She even invited me in for a friendly cup of coffee while insisting she had no idea what I was talking about. Inside, I could almost feel the tension building like the air was charged. Karen loved this kind of drama and she was feeding off it. Every second I stood there, I felt like I was walking a tightrope. One wrong word and she might turn the conversation around on me, painting me as the unreasonable neighbor. I left her porch feeling more determined than ever. It was clear she wasn't going to admit anything willingly. Her version of innocence was too polished, too perfect. My gut told me that confrontation alone wasn't enough. I needed proof, something undeniable that could hold up if I involved the authorities. It wasn't just about my mail anymore. It was about showing the neighborhood that no one, not even HOA Karen, could manipulate the rules for their own gain. Back at my house, I started planning. I needed to track my mail more closely, maybe even set up small tests to catch her in the act. I told a few close friends about what was happening and they all laughed nervously. "You're turning into a private investigator," one said. I smiled, but inside I was serious. This wasn't just a joke. If she got away with it, who knew what she'd do next? As I made notes, I remembered that mail theft is actually a federal crime. That thought gave me a strange mix of hope and nerves. If I could get the postal inspector involved, maybe Karen wouldn't be able to weasel her way out this time. But the idea of calling in federal authorities made me uneasy. It sounded dramatic, like something out of a TV show. Yet the more I thought about it, the more I realized it might be the only way to finally stop her. I spent the rest of the day keeping an eye on the mailbox. I noticed how Karen lingered just a little too long when the mail carrier arrived. She glanced over at my house, and for a second, I thought she knew I was watching. It was almost thrilling, like waiting for the first move in a high-stakes game. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain, I wasn't backing down. If Karen wanted a battle, she was going to get one. And I had a secret weapon in mind, someone who didn't play by neighborhood rules, someone who could take this from a petty mail dispute to real consequences. Little did I know, this confrontation was just the beginning. Things were about to escalate, and the quiet street I thought I knew was about to become a stage for a showdown that no one would forget. Karen may have thought she was untouchable, but I was about to make sure she learned that even in a small suburban neighborhood, actions have consequences. After the confrontation with HOA Karen, I realized I couldn't rely on luck or hope that my mail would magically stop disappearing. I needed a plan, something concrete. The problem was Karen was clever, or at least she thought she was, and I couldn't just wait for her to slip up on her own. I had to gather evidence, and not just any evidence. I needed proof that would hold up beyond a shadow of a doubt. The first step was observation. I started paying attention to every delivery. Every morning, I watched from my kitchen window as the mail carrier drove down the street. I tried to look casual, sipping my coffee and pretending to read a magazine, but inside I was analyzing every movement. Did Karen come outside when the carrier arrived? Did she walk slowly past my mailbox, pretending to check her own? Little things like that mattered. Each glance, each pause felt like a piece of a puzzle. I also began keeping a detailed log. Every missing letter, every package that didn't arrive, I wrote it down. I noted dates, times, and any odd behavior I noticed from Karen or even other neighbors. Friends started asking if I was becoming obsessive. "You're turning into a neighborhood detective," one said with a laugh. I smiled, but inside I was deadly serious. This wasn't a game. I was building a record that would prove my case if I needed to escalate it. To add another layer, I decided to test the waters. I sent myself a few innocuous letters, nothing important, just regular envelopes with my name on them. I watched to see if they made it to my mailbox. Sure enough, a few of them vanished. The pattern was clear and the culprit was becoming harder to deny. Every time I saw Karen lingering near the mailbox or acting overly curious about my deliveries, my suspicion grew. It was maddening and oddly thrilling at the same time. I also thought about technology. Could I set up a camera or some kind of discreet device to catch her in the act? After a little research, I realized that there are rules about surveillance on private property. I didn't want to break the law myself or give Karen an excuse to claim harassment. That's when the idea hit me, the postal inspector. Mail theft is a federal crime, and if I could involve someone with authority, someone Karen couldn't intimidate, I might finally get results. The more I researched, the more I realized how serious mail theft really is. It's not just a petty neighborhood issue, it's a federal offense. The postal inspector has the power to investigate, gather evidence, and even make arrests. It sounded dramatic, almost like something out of a TV show, but I also knew this might be the only way to stop Karen. If she got away with it this time, who knew what she would do next? I reached out to a friend who had dealt with the Postal Service before and got some advice on how to involve an inspector without making things too obvious. We discussed ways to document the theft, how to report missing mail properly, and what to do if Karen tried to cover her tracks. It felt like planning a small operation, and honestly, it was exciting in a nerve-wracking way. I felt like I was turning from a passive neighbor into someone who actually had a chance to take control of the situation. Over the next few days, I combined observation with subtle tracking. I noted every time the mail arrived where Karen was standing and how she behaved. I even left a few letters in the mailbox with little hints to track them, just enough so that if she took them, I could prove it. It was like a high-stakes game of chess where every move mattered and one misstep could ruin the whole plan. As I prepared to involve the postal inspector, I felt a strange mix of nerves and hope. On one hand, I was about to bring federal authorities into a small suburban neighborhood. On the other hand, I finally had a way to hold Karen accountable. The tension was almost unbearable, but I knew I had to see it through. If I succeeded, not only would my mail be safe, but I would also send a clear message. Even in a quiet street, people can't get away with doing whatever they want. Little did I know, the arrival of the postal inspector would change everything. What started as a missing envelope had grown into a suspenseful, dramatic, and oddly humorous showdown. My quiet neighborhood was about to get a lot less peaceful, and Karen had no idea what was coming. The trap was about to be set, and I was ready to see it unfold. The day the postal inspector arrived felt almost surreal. I had imagined this moment countless times while plotting my little operation, but seeing it unfold in real life was something else entirely. He pulled up in a plain, unassuming car, nothing flashy, yet somehow he commanded attention just by stepping out. He was calm, professional, and carried himself with that quiet authority that made you immediately trust he knew what he was doing. HOA Karen, of course, was outside, doing her usual keeping an eye on everyone routine. The second she saw a stranger step out of a car with a clipboard and a badge, her expression changed. First came the confusion, then the forced smile, and finally a subtle panic that she clearly tried to hide. I could barely contain a small laugh as she fussed with her hair and adjusted her blouse, clearly thinking about how to charm this new person in the neighborhood. She didn't know the inspector wasn't buying it. The inspector introduced himself politely, but with a tone that carried weight. He asked a few general questions about the neighborhood, the deliveries, and the missing mail. I answered carefully, trying not to show my nerves. The inspector's eyes missed nothing. He glanced at Karen, who was hovering nearby like a cat waiting to pounce, and his gaze lingered just long enough to make her fidget. It was almost poetic justice, seeing her forced to behave normally in front of someone she couldn't intimidate. He asked me to explain what had been happening, and I laid it out in detail. I described the missing letters, the packages, the suspicious behavior, and the confrontation I had with Karen. I even mentioned the letters I had sent myself to test the situation. He listened patiently, jotting notes without interrupting, giving me the sense that he was taking every word seriously. It was strange to feel a mix of relief and tension at the same time. Relief that someone was finally paying attention, tension because Karen could sense that things were shifting against her. HOA Karen tried to interject a few times, offering explanations that were so rehearsed they almost sounded like a comedy routine. "Oh, I just help my neighbors," she said, waving her hands dramatically. "I thought it was community mail. I would never do anything wrong." The inspector didn't flinch. He simply nodded politely, made a few more notes, and continued questioning me. I could see Karen's frustration building. She wasn't used to someone not being charmed or intimidated by her. As the inspector looked around the street, taking in the houses and the mailbox areas, he quietly explained to me that catching someone in the act was the only way to guarantee a solid case. We couldn't rely solely on accusations or missing items. We needed proof that would stand up in court if it came to that. I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. The trap was being set, and every small observation I had made over the past few days suddenly seemed more valuable than ever. While he spoke, I noticed Karen trying to edge closer, as if hoping to influence the conversation. It was almost comical. She leaned slightly toward the inspector, whispered something, then realized he was ignoring her entirely. Her subtle panic grew into visible discomfort, and I felt a small surge of satisfaction. The woman who thrived on control and attention suddenly had none. It was a rare sight, and I couldn't help but smirk. The inspector wrapped up his initial observations and asked me to stay alert, suggesting that we coordinate the next steps carefully. He mentioned he would be watching discreetly while I continued my usual routine, making sure Karen didn't suspect anything. It was tense, but also strangely thrilling. The quiet street I had always taken for granted was transforming into a stage for a slow-burning showdown. As he got back into his car and drove off to position himself nearby, I felt my heart racing. Karen watched him leave, her eyes following every movement, clearly aware that her little schemes were under scrutiny. I went back inside, peeking out the window, and I realized that the next few days would be critical. Every delivery, every step Karen took, every glance she made could be the moment we finally caught her. I settled in, trying to act normal, but inside I was buzzing with anticipation. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope that my mail would be safe and that Karen would finally face consequences for her actions. Little did I know, the next time she reached for my letters, everything we had planned would come together in a tense, dramatic, and unforgettable way. The quiet suburban street was about to become a scene of suspense, and I was ready to witness it all. The morning of the stakeout felt like something out of a spy movie. I tried to act casual, sipping coffee on my porch, pretending to read a magazine while keeping my eyes glued to the mailbox. Every sound seemed louder than usual, the birds chirping, the mail truck rumbling down the street, even the distant bark of a dog felt like a signal. I was tense, jittery, but also thrilled. After weeks of planning and observation, the moment to catch HOA Karen in the act had finally arrived. I could see her house from my porch just a few doors down, and sure enough, Karen was moving around. She seemed unaware that the postal inspector was nearby, quietly watching from a discreet distance. She paced a little, checked her porch, and then glanced toward my mailbox. My heart started to race. She was doing exactly what we had anticipated. The trap was working. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself to stay still. It wasn't easy. I shifted in my chair, careful not to make a sound. My cat, oblivious to the tension, jumped onto my lap, which almost gave me away. I shushed her, feeling my pulse quicken. Every second felt like an hour, and I couldn't believe this was really happening in my otherwise quiet street. As the mail carrier approached, delivering letters to the neighboring houses first, I noticed Karen subtly inching closer to my mailbox. She pretended to be doing something else, maybe checking her own mail, but her eyes were fixed on mine. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and excitement. This was the moment we had been waiting for. She reached for the mailbox and, carefully glancing around to make sure no one was watching, pulled out my letters. She held them in her hands for a few seconds, and I could see the satisfaction on her face. She thought she had pulled it off. I could hardly breathe. Every fiber of me wanted to jump up and shout, but I knew that would ruin everything. The postal inspector, just a few houses away, moved quietly into position. His calm presence contrasted sharply with my jittery excitement. I kept my eyes on Karen, pretending to sip my coffee while mentally counting down the seconds until the inspector would step in. HOA Karen muttered to herself, clearly unaware that her every move was being watched. She inspected the letters as if they were treasure, probably thinking she had won. It was almost comical. I could hear her whispering things like, "They'll never know," and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. This was the perfect mix of suspense and humor, a suburban showdown unfolding right on my street. And then it happened. The postal inspector moved in, quietly but firmly, approaching Karen from the side. Her eyes widened as she finally realized someone else was there. She froze, holding my letters awkwardly, and looked around, panic starting to creep in. It was almost surreal to watch. The woman who always seemed untouchable, the queen of our little neighborhood, was suddenly caught off guard. I could feel a rush of relief and vindication. The weeks of careful observation, the notes, the test letters, all of it had paid off. Karen's confidence crumbled in seconds. She tried to act casual at first, adjusting her blouse, straightening her hair, but the inspector's presence left no room for theatrics. She stammered, her words meaningless, her excuses unconvincing. From my vantage point, I could see the tension crack in her expression. This wasn't going to end like her usual neighborhood power plays. She wasn't going to get away with taking my mail and pretending nothing happened. For the first time, HOA Karen was vulnerable, and it was fascinating to watch. As the inspector signaled to the officers nearby, I realized just how satisfying this moment was. All the frustration, the anxiety, the fear of confrontation, it all led to this. Karen's world of control and manipulation had a crack in it, and I was witnessing the first real consequences. The trap had worked perfectly. Even as my heart raced, I couldn't help but feel a little amused. Karen, all high drama and exaggerated gestures, caught red-handed with her face frozen in shock. The scene was dramatic, suspenseful, and had a touch of humor that made me grin quietly. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, something extraordinary was happening. My mail and my small sense of justice were about to be restored. The stage was set for the next act, the official confrontation and the arrest. Karen had been caught, but the drama was far from over, and I, sitting on my porch, had a front row seat to a showdown I would never forget. The suspense was unbearable but thrilling, and I couldn't wait to see how it all unfolded in the hands of the postal inspector. The moment had finally arrived. The trap we had planned for weeks was about to be sprung. I sat on my porch, pretending to sip my coffee and scroll through my phone, but every muscle in my body was tense. My eyes never left the mailbox. Karen had no idea that her carefully rehearsed routine was about to be exposed for everyone to see. She stepped toward the mailbox, looking casual, pretending to check her own letters, but I knew better. She lingered a little too long, her hands brushing over the envelopes as if testing her luck. She muttered under her breath, probably congratulating herself on how clever she was. It was almost comical watching someone so confident believe they were untouchable, completely unaware of what was coming. The postal inspector had positioned himself just a few houses away, out of sight but ready to move in at the perfect moment. The tension was unbearable. Every second felt stretched, like waiting for a storm to break. I could feel my heart pounding, my palms sweating, and at the same time a strange thrill ran through me. This was it, the moment we had been planning for weeks. HOA Karen reached for my letters, and just as her fingers touched the envelopes, the inspector stepped forward. She froze immediately. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, and the letters wobbled in her hands. It was the classic look of someone caught red-handed, and I couldn't help but stifle a laugh. The queen of our neighborhood, who had ruled with her HOA rules and over-the-top drama, was finally vulnerable. She tried to act casual at first, adjusting her blouse and sunglasses, trying to convince herself and anyone watching that this was all a misunderstanding. "Oh, I was just checking for the community mail," she stammered, her voice high-pitched and shaky. The inspector didn't flinch. He calmly asked her to step aside, his tone firm but professional. She glanced around nervously, realizing for the first time that she wasn't in control. I watched from my porch, barely breathing. Every second of her hesitation, every awkward shuffle of her feet felt like a victory. The weeks of observation, the careful tracking of my mail, and the subtle test letters I had left in the mailbox had all led to this moment. The trap had worked perfectly. HOA Karen started to panic, dropping the letters slightly as she fumbled to explain herself. "I thought it was for everyone. I was just helping, you don't understand." Her words came out in a jumble, no longer coherent. The inspector remained calm, patiently asking questions and taking notes. It was clear that no excuse would save her this time. I could see the tension in the street rising. A few neighbors had noticed something unusual, peeking out from behind curtains or walking past slowly, curious about what was happening. Karen's dramatic flair, usually so effective at commanding attention and sympathy, was failing spectacularly. She was caught, and there was no performance that could reverse it. As the inspector secured the letters, I felt an immense sense of relief. My mail was safe again, and the woman who had intimidated the neighborhood for so long was finally being held accountable. There was also a strange satisfaction in seeing her so flustered, realizing that her usual tactics of charm and control no longer worked. It was a rare and satisfying feeling. Karen's panic became almost theatrical. She wrung her hands, muttered under her breath, and even tried to appeal to imaginary witnesses as if anyone would believe her story now. The inspector calmly informed her that taking someone's mail is a federal offense and that further steps would be taken. It was the moment her reality shifted from confident HOA ruler to someone facing real consequences. I leaned back on my porch, trying to absorb everything that was happening. The quiet suburban street, the place where I had once felt safe and bored by the monotony, had become a scene of suspense, drama, and just a touch of humor. My mail, my small sense of justice, and the principle that no one is above the rules had all converged in this one tense moment. As Karen finally realized she couldn't escape the situation, the inspector gave a nod to his team, signaling that the next steps would be taken. My heart was still racing, but I knew the trap had succeeded. The long wait, the careful planning, and the weeks of observation had all paid off. The quiet street was never going to look the same again, and neither would HOA Karen. The stage was set for the final act, her arrest, and the aftermath that would leave the neighborhood talking for weeks. The arrest was nothing short of cinematic. I watched from my porch as HOA Karen, now pale and trembling, realized that the situation had escalated far beyond anything she had ever faced in our little neighborhood. The postal inspector had called in uniformed officers, and they approached with calm efficiency. Karen's confident posture crumbled immediately. The queen of the HOA was finally exposed for what she really was. Her protests started immediately. "Wait, you don't understand," she shouted, waving her arms dramatically. "I was just helping the community. Everyone does this. This is unfair." Her voice cracked as she tried to maintain some semblance of authority, but it was too late. The officers didn't flinch. They had seen this before, and nothing in her theatrics would change the fact that she had stolen my mail. I could see her glancing around, hopping for support from neighbors, but most of them were already watching from a safe distance, whispering to each other and trying not to laugh. The sheer absurdity of her behavior made it almost comical. One neighbor even muttered to another, "Wow, she really thought she was untouchable." I tried to stifle my own laugh, feeling a mix of relief, vindication, and amusement. After weeks of frustration, the dramatic showdown was finally unfolding. The officer spoke to Karen calmly but firmly, explaining her rights and the charges against her. She nodded quickly, then shook her head, then tried to argue, then paused. It was a mess of confusion, panic, and indignation. Every word she spoke sounded like a desperate attempt to regain control, but no one was listening. I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. For once, her usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation had failed completely. As they gently but firmly placed her under arrest, Karen made one last attempt at theatrics. She flailed her arms slightly, shouted something about how unfair it was, and even tried to appeal to the postal inspector directly. "You don't understand, this is community mail," she exclaimed. The inspector looked at her calmly and shook his head. He had heard it all before, and her excuses held no weight. I watched my letters being secured finally return to their rightful place. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The weeks of observation, the careful planning, and the coordination with the inspector had all led to this moment. My mail was safe, Karen had been held accountable, and the quiet suburban street had been forever changed. Neighbors started to peek out from behind curtains, some taking cautious steps closer. Whispers spread quickly. "Did you see that? HOA Karen got arrested for taking mail." Finally, it was surreal to see the neighborhood buzzing with curiosity, relief, and even amusement. I felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. Something so small, a few letters and packages, had turned into a dramatic, unforgettable event that everyone would be talking about for weeks. I took a deep breath, letting the tension drain from my body. For the first time in what felt like months, I could relax. The trap had worked perfectly, and justice had been delivered in a way that was both dramatic and satisfying. Karen's usual aura of control and power was gone, replaced with confusion, embarrassment, and a hint of fear. It was poetic justice, plain and simple. As the officers escorted her away, she kept muttering under her breath, throwing glances back at the street as if daring someone to speak up. But the neighbors stayed silent, watching in stunned silence. It was a quiet triumph, a victory without fanfare, and yet it felt monumental. The lesson was clear: even in a small suburban neighborhood, no one is above the rules. I leaned back on my porch, sipping my coffee and trying to process everything. My mailbox, my small piece of the neighborhood, had been defended. HOA Karen had been stopped, and for once the quiet streets felt peaceful again. But I also knew that the story of this dramatic, suspenseful, and slightly humorous showdown would live on in the neighborhood forever. Sometimes, the most unexpected battles leave the longest memories, and this was certainly one of them. After HOA Karen was taken away, the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual quiet, though there was an unmistakable buzz in the air. Neighbors peeked out their windows more than usual, exchanged knowing glances, and whispered about the dramatic events that had unfolded. It felt surreal to realize that something as small as stolen mail had created a story everyone would remember for years. I checked my mailbox for the first time in weeks without anxiety. Every letter and package was there, exactly where it should be. The sense of relief was overwhelming. Little things like a birthday card from my niece, bills that had caused weeks of worry, and even small catalogs I hadn't cared about suddenly felt like treasures. I realized how much those small daily routines mattered and how easily someone could disrupt them when no one was paying attention. The neighbors slowly started approaching me, some hesitantly, some with barely contained excitement. They shared their own frustrations with Karen's behavior over the years, and I listened, smiling quietly. It was almost funny to hear how many people had been affected indirectly by her obsession with control. Everyone had a story, a faked complaint, a petty fine, or a dramatic warning about the color of their mailbox. My little victory seemed to resonate more broadly than I had anticipated. HOA Karen, of course, became the talk of the street. Her dramatic antics during the arrest were replayed in whispered recountings, and the sheer absurdity of her protests became a source of amusement for many. Neighbors laughed quietly, comparing notes on her over-the-top excuses and the way she tried to claim it was for the community. It was satisfying to see that her reign of intimidation had ended, if only temporarily, and that people were finally free to move about without fear of her scrutiny. I took a moment to reflect on the lessons I had learned. First, paying attention matters. Little signs can reveal big truths if you notice them. Second, documenting evidence is crucial. Without the logs, the test letters, and careful observation, Karen might still be stealing mail without consequence. And finally, sometimes you need to involve the right authorities. Bringing in the postal inspector had been nerve-wracking, but it had been the only way to ensure justice. Even now, weeks later, I still catch myself smiling when I think about the stakeout. The tension of those mornings, the thrill of watching Karen reach for my letters, and the moment the inspector stepped in, it all feels like a story that could belong in a TV drama. Yet it was real. It happened in our quiet suburban street to a neighbor just trying to get her mail. The mix of suspense, humor, and drama made it unforgettable. I also realized that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean confrontation or anger. Sometimes it's about strategy, patience, and knowing when to act. Karen had relied on fear, charm, and manipulation to maintain control. When those tools failed, she crumbled. It was a satisfying reminder that justice doesn't always come loudly or immediately, it comes when you prepare, observe, and involve the right people. As life returned to normal, my mailbox became more than a place for letters, it became a symbol of small victories. Every time I opened it, I remembered the weeks of suspense, the humor in Karen's panicked expressions, and the satisfaction of knowing that rules still mattered. Neighbors started joking with me about being the mail hero, a title that made me laugh quietly. It wasn't about fame, though it was about reclaiming a small piece of peace in our community. Hoa Karen, of course, remained a presence in conversation, but she was no longer the looming figure of authority she once was. Her absence during that time served as a reminder of how fragile control can be when it's built on intimidation rather than respect. The neighborhood had shifted subtly, becoming a place where people felt empowered to speak up and watch out for one another. In the end, it was a story of vigilance, courage, and quiet triumph. A few stolen letters had sparked weeks of suspense, dramatic confrontation, and moments of humor that no one would forget. My mailbox had been defended, Hoa Karen had faced consequences, and the street returned to its rhythm, forever changed by one small act of standing up for what was right. Sometimes I still glance at the mailbox and smile, remembering the tense mornings, the inspector's calm authority, and Karen's flustered panic. It's a reminder that even in small suburban neighborhoods, justice can prevail, and that sometimes the smallest battles end with the biggest satisfaction. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.